Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from a channel called Tomorrow's World, which I'm about 99% certain is affiliated with the Restored Church of God, which is led by the guy whose name caused me to do many a double take whenever I see David Pakman do anything, because I heard of David Pak before I heard of David Pakman. Anyway, in this video he lists 4 reasons we should all distrust evolution, so let's take a look.
Is evolution the fact you've been told it is? Or is there reason to doubt Darwin and variations of his theory? Many discoveries made over the last half-century call into question whether life as we know it could possibly be the result of random chance.
Starting with the fact that nobody who understands evolution is of the opinion that life as we know it is the result of random chance. Sure, the mechanisms that change the actual DNA are random, but the selection pressures that decide which changes survive and reproduce and which changes die off are decidedly not random. For example, it is not random that warm-blooded creatures with thick layers of fat and/or fur evolved in cold climates.
One scientist with a PhD in molecular and cellular biology thinks otherwise.
Is it Jonathan Wells? It's Jonathan Wells, isn't it? Do you know how I know that? Because he's the only one. And he went into his educational program for the explicit purpose of being able to come out the other end with valid credentials that he could then use to discredit evolution. His very existence is a refutation of the claim that creationists are discriminated against in the academic and scientific communities, or he would never have been able to get his PhD.
Jonathan Wells stated the following in an interview with Lee Strobel. The evidence for Darwinism is not only grossly inadequate, it's systematically distorted. I'm convinced that sometime in the not-too-distant future, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 years from now, people will look back in amazement and say, how could anyone have believed this? Darwinism is merely materialistic philosophy masquerading as science, and people are recognizing it for what it is.
Okay, that's nice. We have one highly educated man stating that it is his opinion that evolution will be looked at as a ridiculous and antiquated idea sometime in the future. You can find educated people saying stupid things fairly easily, especially when the person you find starts his education with the presupposition that what he would be learning is incorrect.
On today's program, I'll give you 4 reasons to be a Darwin skeptic. So let's begin. Reason number 1, you are not alone. Lee Strobel is a former atheist who firmly believed in evolution.
Lee Strobel is a man who claims to be a former atheist who firmly believed in evolution, but then wrote his book in such a way that it presents him as having been pretty much the exact straw man of atheism that religious people usually expect, but which isn't usually accurate. Now, I'm not saying he is lying, but if he were telling the truth, then he wasn't a very good representative of atheists as a whole.
In this well-researched treatise, he describes how 100 scientists from a variety of highly specialized disciplines with PhDs from well-known and prestigious universities reacted to a 7-part PBS series that asserted that all known scientific evidence supports evolution.
Yeah, he certainly did find a lot of PhD holders to back up his pre-drawn conclusions. Like when he interviewed philosophers like William Lane Craig and Stephen Meyer and J.P. Moreland on subjects like cosmology and DNA. He does occasionally get people with relevant credentials to talk about their actual field of expertise, like when he talked to Guillermo Gonzalez, who is actually an astronomer, about astronomy. But using this as an example, these arguments typically fall flat on their face. They discuss how perfect the Earth is for supporting life, and essentially claim that it's not possible for another Earth-like planet to exist anywhere in the universe. And Strobel, who claims at the beginning of his book that he will be asking the hard-hitting skeptical questions that plagued him when he was an atheist, basically just nods along with everything and asks softball questions like, they believe if you can just find a place anywhere in the universe where water stays liquid for a long enough period of time, then life will develop just as it did on Earth. I assume you agree with that. Actually, one of my favorite quotes from the interview is when Strobel points out that there are life forms on planet Earth that can exist living off what comes out of deep-sea geothermal vents and don't need oxygen oxygen. Gonzalez then dismisses this out of hand, stating that there are only a few organisms that don't need oxygen, and any of the large ones do. Okay, that's nice. But the fact remains that it is possible to have life without oxygen, which means you don't need a nice little oxygen-rich planet like the Earth in order for life to form. In fact, and I have trouble believing that Gonzalez is unaware of this, but the life that would have evolved first on Earth would have been poisoned by the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere today. We have the environment that we have today because they produced oxygen as a waste product.
As does virtually every reputable scientist in the world. In response, these credentialed scientists reacted by posting a 2-page ad in a national magazine in which they wrote, "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged."
Yes, the scientific descent from Darwinism. Just look at that statement. If you didn't know that it was coming from a creationist organization, let's just call a spade here, the Discovery Institute is a creationist organization even if they use the label intelligent design, there is nothing inherently wrong with that statement. If you are even slightly familiar with science, you will understand that every idea should be subject to skepticism. And when the National Center for Science Education looked into the document, they found that the actual opinions of the signatories ranged very broadly, from outright creationists, to legitimate scientists who have issues with abiogenesis, to scientists who agree that we all evolved but think that there might not be one single universal common ancestor, to science who took it to mean that they have a healthy skepticism of evolution just as they would any other scientific field, to scientists who understand that specifically Darwinian evolution refers to evolution as presented by Darwin, and ignoring the last 150 years of scientific advances, so they accept evolution but understand that Darwin was wrong in several areas. And that's ignoring the fact that the vast majority of the signatories have little to no biological expertise. There's also evidence that the Discovery Institute changed the wording of the statement after they collected the signatures. And there's also the NCSE's Project Steve, where they get PhD holders to sign off on the statement, "Evolution is a vital, well-supported, unifying principle of the biological sciences, and the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the idea that all living things share a common ancestry. Although there are legitimate debates about the patterns and processes of evolution, there is no serious scientific doubt that evolution occurred, or that natural selection is a major mechanism in its occurrence. It is scientifically inappropriate and pedagogically irresponsible for creationist pseudoscience, including but not limited to intelligent design, to be introduced into the science curricula of our nation's public schools." But there's one catch. In order to sign the statement, you have to not only have a PhD, but also be named Steve, or some variation thereof. They are far more selective about who they allow to sign. A significant portion of the descent from Darwinism signatories are nowhere close to PhD status, being dentists, electrical engineers, computer scientists, and the like. Project Steve has over 1,400 signatories, at least one of whom, Steve Murphy, was also a signatory of the Descent from Darwinism petition, who has since had his name removed. Does Project Steve prove evolution? No, but it demonstrates that it is overwhelmingly accepted by the vast majority of the scientific community. With deceptive tactics, the Discovery Institute managed to scrape together about 1,000 signatures for a very weak condemnation of accepting evolution without skepticism, while being much less picky about who they allow to sign. There are more PhD scientists named Steve who accept evolution than there are scientists, engineers, mathematicians, doctors, and dentists and more of any name who have qualms about evolution.
Now, who were these skeptics? Were they high school biology or junior high astronomy teachers? Were they narrow-minded religious fanatics? Far from it.
Yeah, far from it. They were literally anyone with any kind of advanced degree that the Discovery Institute could trick into signing.
They were world-class scientists like Nobel nominee Henry F. Schaefer, the third most cited chemist in the world.
So, not a biologist.
James Tour of Rice University's Center for Nanoscale Science and Technology.
So, again, not a biologist.
And Fred Figworth, professor of cellular and molecular physiology at Yale Graduate School.
You may be wondering here why they didn't show a picture of Fred Figworth. Well, It's because he's an exceedingly difficult gentleman to track down. The Yale Graduate School directory does not list him. A Google search for his name yields a plethora of creationist sites saying the exact same that you just said pretty much verbatim, and they all say it without attributing the quote back to Lee Strobel's book, which I think is the origin. But I even searched the list of signatories on the Dissent from Darwinism. Figworth just isn't there. Which means he either never signed in the first place, or he was one of the many people who was tricked into signing by the Discovery Institute's dishonest practices, and later petitioned them to remove his name. So your top 3 examples of scientists who don't accept evolution are 2 non-biologists, and 1 who either doesn't exist or changed his mind about being associated with the list. And yes, James Tour does have a lot to do with biochemistry, but if you'll recall from the Pseudoscience Uprising series, he's the angry guy who just yells very loudly that we haven't figured out every last detail of abiogenesis yet, and he uses big words so it can sound convincing. Now I'm skipping a bunch because he just talks about Antony Flew for a bit, the philosopher who, when he was getting old and losing control of his faculties, was convinced that a very loose deistic sort of god exists. If you want the whole story on that, here's Apologia video.
Good company is comforting, but doesn't prove anything.
Then why even bother bringing it up? Seriously, we're almost 7 minutes into your video, and all you've said in that 7 minutes is that there are some smart, well-educated people who don't fully accept evolution. Now you're crumpling that whole portion up and throwing it out, stating that you actually understand that this ultimately doesn't mean anything. What was the point in the first 7 minutes of your video if you're just going to dismiss it yourself?
So why have so many former evolutionists become skeptics? Let's look at the empirical evidence. Reason number 2, the fossil record does not support evolution.
Oh goody, fossils. Let's see how this goes.
Science teachers and natural history documentaries convince millions that the fossil record proves evolution, but nothing can be further from the truth. The evidence demonstrates the exact opposite, and scientists know this.
So, the modern definition of evolution when speaking about the theory of evolution in biology is the change in allele frequencies in a population over successive generations. The exact opposite of that would be all the allele frequencies staying exactly the same in a population over successive generations. Now, I could see an argument being made that the fossil record doesn't say anything either way. I mean, you can't exactly examine the DNA of a fossil, as the DNA doesn't last long enough to survive through the fossilization process. So strictly speaking, fossils can't show the change or the consistency of allele frequencies. However, since genetics determine morphology, we are fairly safe in assuming that the wildly different morphologies that we see in the fossil record represent different genetics as well. But yeah, scientists know that the fossil record demonstrates perfectly that allele frequencies have remained absolutely constant over time. Right. Now I'm skipping a bit because he goes on a long tirade about how hippos and crocs have a common ancestor some 55 million years ago, which is a number that I have trouble accepting, as crocodiles and alligators have a common ancestor that lived about 90 million years ago. So I would think that it goes further back than that to get to the mammalian common ancestor. I could be wrong though, probably not. Anyway, he just rambles about how hippos and crocs are very different, which I don't think anyone would disagree with. But with at least tens of millions of years to evolve, more likely hundreds of millions, nobody would expect them to be identical.
But they had 55 million years to make these changes. Now, I'll admit that this is a long time. But do you realize that that very fact works against evolution?
So, the fact that there has been plenty of time for evolution to occur somehow works against evolution? Please elaborate.
And here's why. First, have you ever noticed that the beginning point is always described as a common ancestor?
Not so much the beginning point, but the diverging point. And yeah, common ancestor is an accurate way to describe it. A common ancestor is nothing more than an ancestor that 2 living organisms have in common. Hence the name, common ancestor. You and your cousins have your grandparents as your common ancestors. Even in the young Earth creationist worldview, everyone shares Noah as a common ancestor, and going back further, Adam and Eve. But when you're looking at it scientifically, we are able to use DNA to map out our relationships, and using DNA, we find that we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. And this uses the exact same methodology as when we use DNA to tell who our first cousins are. It's just farther removed. The farther back in time you go, the more difficult it is to accurately say which species share which common ancestors, for the simple reason that we just can't examine the genetic evidence for the vast majority of the organisms found in the fossil record, so we have to go by morphology instead. But we use morphology exclusively until genome sequencing became common, and by using genome sequencing, we have found that morphology is surprisingly accurate. The two didn't have to match up, but they did, which lends even more evidence to the side of evolution.
Evolutionists take offense when someone says man came from an ape. Instead, they say apes and man came from a common ancestor.
You know, I've never heard anyone except creationists get upset at the idea that humans are descended from apes. In fact, humans are a type of ape. We belong in the great ape category with the chimps, orangutans, gorillas, and bonobos. This is a part of cladistic taxonomy. Ape parents will always have ape children, so our descendants will always be categorized as a subsection of the ape category. Usually, the subjection comes up in creationism in the form of incredulity at the idea of being descended from apes, and usually the creationists will talk about a specific type of extant ape, like chimps. And actually, I'm being way too careful with my language here because usually the creationists will discuss monkeys rather than apes, and ask about a man coming from monkeys. So someone who understands evolution might, at this moment, point out that the human's ancestral line intersects with the monkey's ancestral line with the Crown Catarrhini group, but we are not directly descended from anything that you might call a monkey today, though technically apes are a subsection of the Old World monkey group, so you might say that humans are a type of monkey, but there are important distinctions between ape and monkey categories. So the careless use of the term monkey should be discouraged, in my opinion. Not because we take offense to being classified as monkeys, but to avoid confusion with people that don't spend so much time thinking about the finer details of evolution. You know, like most normal people.
An ancestor only found in artists' imaginations, never in the fossil record.
Except for when it is found in the fossil record. Like Sahelanthropus chidensis, Auroran tugenensis, Ardipithecus cadaba, Ardipithecus ramidus, Australopithecus anamensis, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus gari, Paranthropus robustus, Paranthropus bosei, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, and several others that I have skipped. All of these are suspected to be in the human lineage, but the reason we talk about unknown common ancestors is that we cannot guarantee for sure that any one of these species was actually our ancestor. There could have been a sister species alive at the time that we have no knowledge of, that we are actually descended from, but there is no way to tell for sure. So it is quite possible that any or all of these species are actually our direct ancestors, but because we can't demonstrate conclusively one way or the other, we always talk about the unknown common ancestor with these species. But I have never seen an artist rendering of any of the unknown common ancestors, though every single one of these species does have artistic rendering of what it might have looked like based on the fossils. But I can assure you that we don't make scientific decisions based on an artistic rendering.
But the far greater problem is that transitioning from an imaginary common ancestor to a hippo or a crocodile would require thousands of transitional forms for both creatures.
Probably more like millions. Yeah. And we don't have every single one. In fact, the ancestral line leading to hippos is not very well accounted for in the fossil record. This doesn't mean it didn't happen, just that either the ancestors didn't get fossilized often, or that we just haven't found the ones that did. Fossilization is not only very rare, but events that damage or destroy parts of the fossil record are quite common. And as I'm looking into it, I'm coming to doubt your 55 million year common ancestor with crocodiles even more, as the common ancestor between hippos and whales existed about 54 million years ago, and by that point it definitely would have been mammalian. I'm thinking you'd have to go back at least a couple 100 million years before the Dimetrodon to get to the common ancestor of hippos and crocodiles.
Why are these missing from the fossil record?
Because the fossilization process is finicky and very specific, so only a tiny percentage of organisms to ever exist actually get fossilized, and then there are events that can damage or destroy the fossils. If you're not happy with the fossil record for the hippo, then just look at the whales. They have some excellent transitional fossils in their lineage. In fact, with how spotty the fossilization process is, it's amazing that we have as many fossils as we do, and actually with the amount of life that has come and gone on the planet over billions of years, we would expect most species to not be represented well or at all in the fossil record. So missing fossils is expected, but we can map genetic relationships between living organisms, so fossils, while helpful, are not required.
Well, the speaker on Nat Geo states with authority that crocs and hippos evolved 55 million years ago from a common ancestor. We demand to see the evidence in the rocks to back this up.
And I demand to see the evidence that this is actually what the person from Nat Geo actually said. 55 million years ago was well after the mammals diverged from the reptiles. I finally decided to quickly Google it, and it looks like the lineage that led to the mammals became distinct from the lineage that led to reptiles about 320 to 315 million years ago. There are plenty of transitions in that lineage that lead to both crocodiles and mammals, neither of which look very croc-like or very hippo-like until fairly recently. More recently in the case of hippos and the crocs, as crocodiles have looked superficially similar for about 200 million years now. I see you, person who commented to correct me on this earlier. Now you have to go down and edit your comment. And do you know what? I'm not sorry. You should watch the whole video before commenting. This is all your fault. Ha ha.
Our third reason to put evolution on trial is life arising by chance is mathematically impossible.
Before even getting into this one, I just want to point out that the origin of the first organism is largely irrelevant to evolution. Evolution just requires that life exists. Do you deny that life exists? No. So you can plunk God down into that gap in our knowledge of how life originated if you like, but the fact of the matter is that life does exist, and it does evolve. I understand that it's difficult to divorce these two concepts in your mind as they seem inextricably linked, but if you were somehow able to demonstrate that it is in fact impossible for life to have originated, then you have done nothing to disprove evolution. That would be an excellent point in favor of a god, but that god would only be necessary to give life a beginning. Evolution will then take it from there.
Most biology students are familiar with the Miller-Urey experiment. Stanley Miller and Harold C. Urey speculated that the Earth's early atmosphere might be composed of water, hydrogen, ammonia, and methane. By a carefully crafted experiment in which they sent electrical charges through a mixture of these chemicals, they were able to produce amino acids,
thereby demonstrating that amino acids can form spontaneously in the right environment, which is the only thing the experiment set out to do. Yes, they were probably wrong about the composition of the early Earth atmosphere, though some research has suggested that they're not as wrong as we previously thought they were, but by complaining about the first such experiment, you are then ignoring 67 years of scientific progress. It has been repeated with a more accurate representation of the early atmosphere. On top of that, we have found amino acids that have formed naturally on meteorites. So this tired old complaint about the very first experiment to demonstrate the formation of amino acids in a plausible natural environment really holds no water, especially since we actually found amino acids that did form spontaneously on meteorites in a natural environment. So the origin of the first amino acids, while still unknown, is definitely not impossible. He then goes on to explain how proteins couldn't possibly have formed spontaneously, which actually is one of the unknowns at this point. The leading hypothesis for protein formation is the RNA world hypothesis, where RNA developed first. RNA has the ability to fold itself like a protein, and it can catalyze its own replication, so this idea has some merit, but the video is getting a bit long for an RNA world deep dive at this point, so I'm skipping this bit. I'm also skipping the probability bit where he uses a calculation by Bill Bryson, an author with several honorary doctorates but not a scientist, where he purports to show that the odds of a single 200 amino acid protein forming are 1 in 10 to the 260th power. Of course, this calculation assumes that all amino acid sequences are equally likely, which is simply not the case. Some sequences are more likely than others, and ones that work will be kept around by natural selection, whereas the ones that don't work just don't work. Think of it this way. If you throw a handful of quarters onto the table, they will randomly appear as either heads or tails, and the sequence in which they show heads or tails will therefore be completely random. If, however, you toss a bunch of magnets onto the table, the probability of certain orientations arising from the random toss will be much greater than others due to magnetic forces. Same thing with amino acids forming proteins. Some patterns of amino acids will work and others are nearly impossible to even form, so they just won't form. So to assign an equal probability for all of these different combinations when some have much higher probabilities than others is just ridiculous.
Well, our fourth reason for putting evolution on trial is there is no such thing as a simple cell.
Well, not today there isn't, but that's after 3 billion years of evolution. The original simple cell could have just been a phospholipid bilayer containing an RNA molecule.
But as atheists and evolutionists with PhDs discover this truth, is it any wonder that many quietly admit that evolution is guilty of fraud?
Citation fucking needed. The rest of the video is just him quoting Bible verses, so that's where I'll leave it for today. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Daniel Houk. Daniel Houk? Houk. I gotta start looking at these names before I select the comment of the day. From Daniel Houk, who says, God must not care about his power much if he lets me defile it like that. I question any definition of defile that includes put cookies on. This was on a video where the person claimed that most people don't know that the Word of God, the Bible, is literally the power of God. And I joked that God must not care about his power very much because I often use my Bible as a coaster, or I'll put snacks on it rather than directly on my desk, and, stuff like that. So he must not care about his power if he lets me defile it like that. So, fair point, having cookies on something doesn't necessarily defile that thing. That's it for today. Remember to follow me on social media, and for early access to my videos, consider becoming a patron. On Sunday, I will be hosting a live stream at about 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will be playing a trivia game to raise money for a holiday fundraiser. And since it's me running the show, the subject of the trivia is penises. So keep your calendar open for that. See you next time! Homo florensis. Homo floresiensis. Why do I do this to myself? Homo floresiensis. Floresiensis.